I'm Charlotte and this is Time Mama Tries to Read. So we're on week 2 of December. It's like the 11th, I think. So yeah, I haven't been doing Vlogmas. I've been really enjoying the Vlogmas videos that I've seen. But to be honest, I haven't even had the time to watch half of the Vlogmas videos. There's no way I could film one. I'll probably call this Vlogmas because it still is, isn't it? Even if I don't do it every day. But yeah, really getting into the Christmas spirit, probably more Christmassy than I've ever been, and I think that's largely down to YouTube. So I finished off the Georges. My mum told me it's not Georges, and that's silly. It's Georges Simenon. So I did the last bit right. I haven't got it because my dad took it, as always. But I just want to say, yeah, I finished that and it was really, really good. And it's amazing how a book that was basically massively depressing was actually really Christmassy and very cheerful in a weird way. Like the last story was about a woman basically trying to prevent a date rape and also about suicide. And yet it was so Christmassy. So I have no idea what that was all about. He's obviously a bit of a genius. And then to sort of lead off from that, I then went straight into Laurie Lee's The Village Christmas. So I said I was going to only read to page about 30-ish because that was where the winter stuff ends, just about here. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't want to go into spring because it isn't spring. I've got to say, I've never read any Laurie Lee. I don't know how big he is in the rest of the world, but his book Cider with Rosie is a bit of a classic over in the UK. I never read it though. I owned it for years, and I think I unhauled it a couple of years ago because I knew I was never going to read it, or I thought I was never going to read it. But it's just awesome. Like, his writing is out of this world. It's not often that I'm blown away sentence by sentence, but I really was in this. You know, I'm an underliner of books. I know, controversial. I didn't used to for years, but then I was like, they're my books. Why am I not underlining them? And yeah, I was just constantly underlining stuff in this. So the Christmas stories were beautiful, and there's bits about snow and the cold air. So he climbs up the valley as a child now in this, and he says, to be walking today is to be followed everywhere by private auras of pearly cloud. I mean, how lovely is that? That idea of your breath being white and it's pearly cloud. The wandering cows are exhaling too, pale balloons of unheard conversation. It's pretty lush. And then he talks about the beechwood, and he sort of imagines it in June with the June thick leaves, reeking of sap and the damp roots of orchids, rustling with foxes and screaming with jays and crammed to the clouds with pigeons. The wood, for the moment, is but the scaffold of summer. It's just beautiful. I mean, that is amazing. So I really, really loved it. A bit that I did find amusing and also a smidge disappointing was there were a couple of bits in there where even in just this tiny portion, he says a couple of things that were a bit cringy if you're female. So one of them is that he talks about the fact that even though he's getting old, he can still appreciate nature. And then he ends by saying, I've got a split iris. I can't read as easily as I could, but I can still see landscapes and girls' legs. Oh, I was just like, no. Like, if anything, put women's legs. Like, if you're gonna objectify women, not girls. When you've got, you know, you're so old, your iris is split. Found that not necessarily surprising. We could all say, oh yes, it's of its age, but when you're reading stuff like that, it does make you just go, oh. And then the bit that I found hilarious was where he's writing a letter in a bit called The Fight to Save Slad, which is a valley in his area of the Cotswolds. He writes, I think it's an essay that he probably had published in a newspaper to try and get good press. And he's so passionate about what the valley means and that we can't have any housing estates on it. We've got to bear in mind now, this part of England, the Cotswolds, is like it is an area of total beauty. But half the reason it's an area of total beauty is because, oh, very windy. Don't know if you can hear that. Sort of the south of England and sort of middle England seem to have a bit of privilege when it comes to saving their countryside that the rest of the UK doesn't. So, you know, Scotland, they'll just chuck a ton of like power stations in the middle of their natural beauty. Wales is reasonably famous for having villages drowned by reservoirs, you know, and reservoirs that then the water goes over the border to England, which, you know, doesn't, we're all in it together and everything, but yeah, there seems to be a lot more protection afforded to certain areas, including Laurie Lee's. So it doesn't really surprisingly get so outraged about a housing estate, because, you know, this is what they do in the south of England. They sort of protest this kind of stuff, and Middle England. So he says, a new housing estate built here will simply open the floodgates. Development will creep up the valley, blotting out fields where youngsters now prowl and run at liberty. Children trapped in new concrete estates will be denied the freedom we knew. They'll become prisoners of television, as most children are today. And as they grow up, they'll start hanging about the streets in gangs and stealing cars. I mean, it's a bit of a leap from a small, probably quite cute housing estate built on a field in the Cotswolds to hanging around in gangs and stealing cars. But it's that kind of level of, I am blinkered to the world, that everybody's guilty of to a certain extent. But I guess writers of his age, gender, and I suppose he wasn't necessarily, I don't know if he was born middle class, but he certainly ended up being very middle class. I guess they're maybe a bit more blinkered than others. So that was really good, and I'm looking forward to the spring bit. And then I read Alice Thomas Ellis's book, The Birds of the Air. So I didn't actually know anything about this book before I chose it. I just knew it was meant to be like an alternative literary Christmas type book. I didn't know who Alice Thomas Ellis was. I guess I should have figured that she was Welsh with a name like that. Her father, I think, was Welsh, and her mother was English. She spent some time in North Wales, but not extensively. So the book is about a woman called Mary whose only child dies. The circumstances aren't revealed. His age isn't revealed. She falls into... well, it's kind of suggested that she's had a breakdown, but in all honesty, she's the only one with any sense in the whole book. So it's kind of a black comedy. Mrs. Marsh, who is the mother of Mary, the grandmother of the child that's died, she decides that everyone needs to just get on with things and just have a normal Christmas. So although that's quite an extreme version, I guess everybody's got a relative that kind of wants to just make everybody just plough on, regardless of what the news is. This is quite an extreme version, but so all the other relatives that come are meant to be quite respectable, but they are all going through just complete nightmares in their own lives, and nobody really knows it. Everyone's desperate to sort of keep it under wraps. The only person who's really willing to deal with the bad stuff that's going on in her life is Mary. So you go into Mary's mind quite a lot, and the insights into grief. I will say, if you've lost anybody close to you, I really think this would be an enormously helpful book to read. There is obviously an element of it being quite triggering, but if you're in the right place, this woman has written from a perspective that I just don't think anybody else could come from unless they'd actually experienced it. And she lost a child in very early infancy. I think her daughter was 2 days old, and she lost a son. I think he was in his late teens, and he was in a coma for 10 months before he passed away. So she has experienced grief on those levels. She had 7 children in total, so 5 surviving children. But yeah, she's obviously used that experience and really honed it, because I don't think you could get pieces like this. I'll read you this bit. So really, really basic. Something that would not occur to you to write, I don't think, unless you've gone through it. Doors had lost significance, since not one would ever open to admit Robin. Walls and windows too now possessed a strange ambivalence. Dangerous and circumscribing, they no longer represented safety or comfort, but merely translated the wilderness into a view, into a humanised, rationalised vision of infinity, the measure of which it was impossible to formulate. So it's tons of stuff like that. That's just one little example. And she sort of sits and observes the world. There's loads of, you know, I could do a whole video on this book, really. There's loads of themes of resurrection. Christianity is quite a big theme, Catholicism. Birds occur again and again. It's very beautifully done. The only criticism I'd make of it is a very similar criticism to what I'd make of Laurie Lee, where at times you feel like Alice Thomas Ellis is of a certain class, where she is, she only knows about what people are like in other classes based on what she's read in the paper, maybe. So there are instances where she writes about the poor students that one of the characters is a professor of, the waifs and strays, the ones that can't go home to Christmas for Christmas because they haven't got families or because they can't afford the train. And they're so stereotyped. Several times race comes into it, but only as an aside. So one of the underprivileged students is black. She talks about how Mrs. Marsh imagines that cities are full of muggers. I think she even says in blackface. So there's an element where she's teasing Mrs. Marsh, but I mean, all the characters are white, and the only time that these sort of this mention of black faces comes up, and it is as blunt as that, is in these instances of poverty and city life, but with no real sense of caring. And that is a sort of reflection of the characters. She also uses the term Red Indians, which is one of my massive triggers for being annoyed at people. And I know in the 80s, there's the excuse to be made that people wouldn't have known. People still don't know now not to say Red Indian, but it still really, really gets on my nerves. So that kind of bubble of, you know, in this, the characters kind of are massively mistrustful and very sort of dismissive of people of a lower class, of even just a smidge lower. Like even a police chief inspector in this is looked upon as being a bit of a commoner. And then you've got the monarchy, who are also hated. So it's just their class that are okay. And she's teasing them about that a bit, but I do feel there was an element of her actually being part of that crowd. And then the other small thing, which would only have annoyed a Welsh speaker, is that there's it seems to be partly set in Wales, although it's not massively clear. The house that they live in is called Melissa Boyd. And I was like, that's a weird name, Melissa Boyd. So Melissa Boyd, as far as I could translate it, is like the sweetness of food. Boyd is food, Mellis is sweet. But it didn't fit right to me when I was saying it in my head. So I checked with a Welsh speaker, and she was like, oh yeah, we wouldn't, you know, even if you were gonna weirdly call your house the sweetness of food, you wouldn't necessarily use those words in that form. And she was sort of trying to mutate the word Mellis so that it fitted, but then it, you know, technical stuff that I don't understand. But it didn't, just from the knowledge of Welsh, it didn't feel right to me. I'd be interested to know what any other Welsh speakers think of that. But then as the book went on, I began to wonder, is she going to tell us what it means? Because an English-speaking audience wouldn't know. And then in the middle she does, but she says she calls it Melissa Boyd, sweet is life. And life in Welsh is bywyd, not Boyd. Boyd is food, and bywyd has got an extra And so, I mean, I was like, is that a joke? Like, as a black comedy, is that a joke? Are we meant to think that the characters think that their house is called one thing when it's another? But actually it's never mentioned again, and I'm pretty sure that just Alice Thomas S made a spelling mistake. And I'm just sad that a book can be reprinted from the 80s all the way till more or less now. I think this is a fairly modern edition, 2012. It's probably still in print now, and nobody wants to even put a footnote about how there's a mistake. It should, you know, it does matter. Stuff like that matters. So anyway, more positive things. I have got lots of buddy reads either on the go or coming up. It's very exciting. I've never had so many buddy reads. There's only one that I've really failed on, and that is my buddy read of Hannah Arendt with the lovely and very forbearing Kate from Happy Occurrence. It's just so technical. I can't read it in the way that I've been reading all my other books this year, where I'm sometimes reading a page, putting it down, seeing to Idris, picking the book up again when I'm cooking, you know. I just don't seem to be able to do it because it's so in depth. I'm not very good with technical text. I never was when I was doing my study. So I kind of need a library room, silence, maybe a mocha, and just a couple of hours, possibly reading it aloud and annoying everybody else in the neighbouring aisles of the library. And I don't have that. So we've put it on hold. She's been very understanding. Kate's been very understanding about it. But my other buddy reads have been much more sort of fictional. So that's, you know, easier for me. So I'm currently doing one. In my next video, I'm going to do a whole video on what they are and how I'm getting on with them. But I'm doing a buddy read with Mercedes from Mercy Reads. I'm just about to start Mystery in White, a Christmas crime story by Jefferson Farejeon, and I'm doing that with Kate Howe. I've just read Country Dance with Sean of Sean the Book Maniac and Ange from Beyond the Pages, and I'm hopefully going to film a little review video of that if I can find the book. I've put it down in my house and I can't find it. And who else? I'm going to be reading another buddy read with Jo Smith, who isn't a booktuber, but all booktubers of value know her because her comments are so insightful, and she's like part of booktube to me, and I'm sure she is to many of you. So I'm very excited to read with her. So I'm not going to tell you about what they are. I'll just save that for the next video. And then in 2019, me and Shan of Shani Reads have decided to embark upon a horrendous journey together, which I'm not, it was her fault because she suggested it, but then I suggested we do it together, so I've done it myself. It could be awesome, but I'll tell you what it's all about in the next video. So there we go. I'm going to end today, as we're still Christmassy, with another little reading from Dylan's book, A Child's Christmas in Wales. And this is the lovely illustration for this. Little boys playing in the snow, and a lone figure walking through the snow. And this is a description of snow. So we've been told there might be snow here on Saturday. So, you know, maybe this will bring snow to you as well, should you want it. But here a small boy says, "It snowed last year too. I made a snowman and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea." But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewashed buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely white-ivied the walls, and settled on the postman, opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white torn Christmas cards. There we go. Hope you're having a lovely day, and I'll see you soon.